The foreclosure notice shook in her hands. But what broke Carol Whitman wasn't the paper. It was the silence that followed. At 68, Carol sat alone at the kitchen table of the Kansas farmhouse she had shared with her husband for over 40 years, staring at the words that would erase everything she had built. 30 days. That was all the bank was giving her before strangers would walk through her front door and take the land that held every memory of her life. The wooden table her husband had built, the old radio he used to fix engines to, the fields they had worked side by side. None of it would be hers anymore. Just a year earlier, she had lost her husband, Richard Whitman, to a sudden heart attack. Since then, she had done everything she could to keep the farm alive, waking before sunrise, tending to animals she could barely manage alone, selling off equipment piece by piece just to make another payment. But it was never enough. Now the debt had caught up with her. The bank didn't see memories, it saw numbers, and those numbers said her life wasn't worth saving. Carol looked around the quiet room, her chest tightening as the weight of it all settled in. This wasn't just land she was losing. It was the last piece of the man she had loved. The life they had built from nothing but hard work and stubborn hope. And for the first time since he was gone, she felt it slipping away, with nothing left to hold on to. For weeks, Carol Whitman every morning before sunrise. She pulled on her worn boots and stepped out into the fields, her breath visible in the cold air as she tried to keep the farm running on her own. She fed the animals, checked the fences, and worked the soil with a strength she no longer truly had. By midday, her back ached, her hands trembled, and the silence around her felt heavier than ever. But she kept going, because stopping meant admitting the end was already here. The farm had been struggling long before her husband passed. Years of bad weather, broken machinery, and falling crop prices had chipped away at everything they had built. And after Richard was gone, there was no one left to carry the weight with her. So Carol did what she could, selling tools, delaying repairs, making partial payments just to buy herself. But time was the one thing she no longer had. When the loan officer, Mr. Harris, stood in her yard explaining that foreclosure was the most practical solution, his words sounded calm, almost reasonable. But to Carol, they felt like a... She nodded while he spoke, but inside, something was breaking. Because this wasn't just a failing farm. It was the last place where her husband still felt real. That night, Carol Whitman couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, too still, like it was already slipping away from her. The foreclosure notice sat on the kitchen table untouched, but impossible to ignore. After hours of staring into the dark, she finally stood up and walked toward the bedroom she had shared with Richard for decades. There was one place she had avoided since the day he died: his dresser. For a moment she hesitated, her hand resting lightly on the worn wood, as if opening it would somehow make the loss real all over again. But with nothing left to hold on to, she slowly pulled the drawer open and began going through his things. His watch, his wallet, old photographs of better days, county fairs, long drives, quiet dinners. Then, near the back, her fingers touched something unfamiliar. A small wooden box. Carol frowned slightly, lifting it out and turning it over in her hands before opening the simple brass latch. Inside, she found a single tarnished key, and a folded letter with her name written across the front. In her heart began to race. As she unfolded the paper and read his words, everything around her seemed to fade. He spoke about the old garage out back, the one he had always kept closed, and how he had been working on something for her, something she might one day need. Carol closed her eyes for a moment, gripping the key tightly. For the first time in weeks, she felt something different. Not hope, but something close to it. The next evening, with the sun sinking low over the dry Kansas fields, Carol Whitman found herself standing in front of the old metal garage her husband had always kept locked. For years, she had walked past it without a second thought, trusting Richard when he said it was just clutter and broken tools. But now, with his letter still fresh in her mind and the key pressed tightly in her hand, the place felt different, almost as if it had been waiting for her. The wind rattled the loose tin panels, and the fading light cast long shadows across the ground. Carol hesitated, her hand resting on the cold lock. She didn't know what she would find inside. Comfort, or another reminder of everything she had lost. But then she thought about the bank's letter. 30 days, and the words Richard had left behind. Taking a slow breath, she slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first, stiff from years of being untouched, but then turned with a sharp metallic click that echoed in the quiet evening. The sound felt final, like a door opening not just to the garage, but to something she had never been meant to see until now. With both hands, Carol pulled the heavy door upward. It groaned loudly, breaking the silence that had hung over the farm for months. She stepped forward into the darkness, her heart beating faster. Whatever Richard had hidden here, she was about to find it. At first, Carol Whitman. The air didn't smell of decay. It smelled of oil, clean metal, care. Carol stepped further inside, her eyes adjusting as she slowly turned in place. The walls were lined with neatly arranged tools, each one hanging in perfect order. Workbenches were clean, organized, and clearly used with precision, not neglect. Boxes were labeled, parts were stored carefully. This wasn't an abandoned garage. It was a workshop. Her heart began to race as she noticed something large in the center of the room, covered by a thick canvas tarp tied down with rope. Every instinct told her this was what Richard had been protecting all those years. With trembling hands, she untied the ropes and sill. The moment the tarp slid off, she froze. Beneath it was a car unlike anything she had ever seen. A sleek, deep blue vintage roadster, its polished chrome catching the faint light, its curves flawless, almost unreal in the quiet space around it. Carol took a step closer, barely breathing. For decades, while she believed her husband was fixing tractors and broken tools, he had been building something extraordinary. And suddenly she understood. This wasn't just a secret. It was a plan. Carol's hands trembled as she reached for the thick folder resting on the workbench beside the car. The moment Carol Whitman opened it, the truth began unfolding page by page. Receipts, photographs, handwritten notes, decades of careful work documented in detail. At the very top was a faded bill of sale. 1965 Shelby Cobra Roadster, purchased long before she and her breath caught. As she flipped through the pages, she saw the years come alive. Engine parts sourced from across the country, restoration photos taken in different seasons, notes written late at night. One line made her stop completely. "If anything ever happens to me, this will take care of Carol." Tears blurred her vision. For 40 years, while she believed he was simply repairing farm equipment, Richard had been quietly restoring something far greater, something he never spoke about, never showed her, but never stopped for her. At the bottom of the folder, she found a letter with her name written across it. As she read his words, the meaning became undeniable. The car wasn't just valuable, it was rare. Carol slowly lowered the paper, her chest tightening with emotion as she looked back at the gleaming blue car. This wasn't luck. This was 40 years of quiet love, built piece by piece, waiting for the moment she would need it most. The next few days felt unreal to Carol Whitman, as if she had stepped into a life that no longer belonged to the woman who had sat at that kitchen table holding a foreclosure notice. But this time, she moved carefully, because she knew what she had discovered wasn't just valuable, it was everything. Instead of rushing to sell the car, Carol reached out to a respected automotive expert, Daniel Cho, from a transportation museum in Denver. When he arrived and stepped into the garage, his reaction said more than words ever could. He circled the deep blue Cobra slowly, running his hand along the polished surface, examining the engine, the restoration work, the documentation. Finally, he looked at her with quiet disbelief. "This is one of the finest restorations I've ever seen." The number he gave her made her go still. Over $1 million. Only a week earlier, she had believed she was about to lose her home forever. Now, standing in that same garage, she realized everything had changed. Not by chance, but by something her husband had been building for decades without ever asking for recognition. Within days, the museum made an offer, $1.3 million. Carol didn't hesitate, because deep down, she understood something clearly now. This wasn't just about saving the farm. It was about honoring what Richard had spent his life preparing for her, quietly, patiently, and without ever needing her to know until now. In the weeks that followed, Carol Whitman stood in the same kitchen where she had once felt everything slipping away. But this time, the silence felt different. It was no longer heavy with fear. It was steady, almost peaceful. The debts were gone. The foreclosure notice that once trembled in her hands had been replaced by something far stronger, a future she thought she had lost forever. But what changed Carol the most wasn't the money. It was the understanding of what her husband had truly given her. Richard hadn't just left behind a valuable car. He had left behind 40 years of quiet devotion. Every late night in that garage, every hidden receipt, every carefully restored piece, it had never been about the machine itself. It had been about making sure she would be safe, even in a world where he could no longer stand beside her. Carol kept the outside of the old garage exactly as it was, weathered and unremarkable. But inside, she transformed it into a bright art studio, returning to a passion she had set aside decades earlier. And in her husband's name, she created a small fund to help struggling farmers, people just like them, avoid losing everything the way she almost had. Each morning, as sunlight filled the space, she would glance at his photograph and whisper a quiet, "Thank you." Because now she understood something most people never do. The greatest acts of love are often the ones you never see, until the moment you need them most. At some point, Carol Whitman stopped thinking about how close she had come to losing everything, and began to understand what she had truly been given. Not just the money, not just the farm, but something far deeper. For weeks, she had replayed those final moments in her mind, the foreclosure notice, the empty rooms, the feeling that her life had quietly come undone. Back then, it had seemed like the end, like all those years of hard work and sacrifice had led nowhere. But now, standing inside the same space that once felt like loss, she saw it clearly. Her husband had never left her unprepared. He had simply chosen a way to protect her that didn't need recognition, didn't need applause, and didn't need to be understood until the exact moment it mattered. And that changed everything. Because real security isn't always visible. It isn't always written down in obvious ways or handed over when you expect it. Sometimes it's built quietly over time, hidden beneath the surface, waiting until life forces you to look deeper. Carol realized that what saved her wasn't luck. It was trust. Trust in the man she had shared her life with. And in the end, trust in herself to follow something uncertain when everything else felt lost. And as she stepped outside into the open fields once again, one quiet truth stayed with her. Sometimes, what feels like the end is simply the moment you finally begin to see what was there all along. Long after everything had settled, Carol Whitman found herself standing in the doorway of the old garage, now filled with light instead of shadows, thinking about how close she had come to walking away from it forever. Just weeks earlier, it had been nothing more than a forgotten building, something she passed every day without a second thought. To everyone else, it had looked worthless. Even to her, it had seemed like just another piece of a life that was falling apart. But now she understood. The garage had never been empty. It had simply been waiting. Waiting for the moment when she had no other options left. When she would finally open the door instead of walking past it. Because if her life hadn't fallen apart, if the pressure hadn't forced her to look closer, she might have never discovered what was hidden there at all. And that realization stayed with her. Because it wasn't just about the garage anymore. It was about everything in life that people overlook, dismiss, or give up on too quickly. The opportunities that don't look impressive. The paths that seem uncertain. The things that only reveal their value when you're willing to take one more step forward. Carol took a slow breath, looking out across the fields she had almost lost, and allowed herself a quiet smile. Because now she knew something she hadn't known before. Sometimes, the door that changes your life is the one you almost never open. For a long time, Carol Whitman believed love was something you could see, spoken in words, shared in moments, proven in the everyday routines of life. But standing in that quiet garage, surrounded by everything Richard had built in silence, she realized how wrong she had been. Because the most important things he ever did for her, she had never witnessed. Not the long nights spent restoring that car piece by piece. Not the sacrifices he made without saying a word. Not the careful planning that stretched across decades, all to make sure she would be safe in a future he knew he might not be part of. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It didn't ask for recognition. It simply existed, waiting for the moment it would matter most. Carol gently ran her hand across the smooth surface of the car one last time before turning away, her heart full in a way she hadn't felt since the day Richard was still beside her. For the first time since losing him, she didn't feel alone, because now she understood. He had never really left her. Sometimes, the deepest love in your life won't come with grand speeches or visible proof. Sometimes, it's hidden in the quiet sacrifices, in the things someone builds for you when you're not looking, in the plans they make just in case one day you'll need them. If you've ever felt like you were left with nothing, take a moment and look again. You might be standing closer to something life-changing than you think. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. What's something in your life that turned out to be more meaningful than it first seemed? And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might help you see your life in a completely different way.